wherever you are in the world. You're very welcome to another episode of the Driving Economic Growth with Innovation on Amoget Radio Communications. My name is Tolu Omodara, and it's such a joy, such a delight, such a pleasure, such a privilege to welcome you to today's edition of the program. How have you been? Hope you've had a wonderful week so far, and hope you're also enjoying the month of June. Well, today we are going to discuss something very, very critical on this program, right? A very critical connector between two themes in the program. So, if you hear Driving Economic Growth with Innovation, essentially there are two parts of the program, right? There is economic growth, like we've been saying, and of course there is innovation. And then the focus this quarter has been more on economic growth. And we've been emphasizing that it's not just innovation for innovation's sake, but the truth is that innovation is also a driver of economic growth. I'm saying that to say that much as we have not overemphasized innovation for its own sake, and we've kept saying that the purpose of innovation should be for economic growth, just like technology should not be for the sake of technology in the private sector, but for the sake of profitability, sustainability, market share increase, and so on and so forth. Similarly, in the public sector, for those with responsibility for stimulating innovation in a nation, developing innovation systems, maintaining the system, upgrading the system, updating it, they are supposed to ensure that the essence of all they are doing with innovation systems is economic growth. Now, much as we've been emphasizing that, one thing is still important to take note of: innovation is still part of the equation. I repeat, innovation is still part of the equation. So, last quarter, where we discussed developing national innovation systems for absorptive capacity, we made it much more evident that there are two parts to the process. One is the innovation, the national innovation systems, and of course the absorptive capacity, which is referring to the ability to take knowledge and use it for economic and social development. That's absorptive capacity. So last quarter we were much more intent on ensuring that we could see that there is an element there are two elements rather. There is the first element, which is the national innovation systems, and then there is the second element, which is the absorptive capacity, and that's the ability of a nation, an institution, an organization to use new information and apply it, right? And especially when it's been applied for economic and social development. Now, I'm saying all that to say that today's episode is going to sort of make that connection a bit more emphatically, right? So, yes, we stand by what we've been doing all through the quarter, that innovation is not for the sake of innovation. In this quarter, we have been much more emphatic on the economic growth aspect of the equation, but we are saying today that innovation is still part of the equation, right? Now, you wonder, why are you doing with all this? So we've had this, we've been talking about innovation for almost 6 months, from January to date. Right, from the first quarter's program to this quarter's program, we talk about innovation. Yes, we know innovation is part of the equation. Yes, we know we've not emphasized it in this quarter as much as last quarter. This quarter has been more about the purpose of innovation, right? That innovation should be targeted. Why are you going with this? Well, where I'm going with this in this quarter, or in this episode, beg your pardon, is that somebody has to be making the connection, right? Somebody has to be making the connection. This quarter has been advocating for a more effective connection between national innovation systems and economic growth. Hence, the theme of the program, which is driving economic growth with innovation. This quarter's program has been saying, yes, we are not innovating for the sake of innovating, just like technology is not for the sake of technology alone in private sector, but for the sake of growth, the sake of market share increase, the customer satisfaction, and all the other metrics by which you will measure effectiveness, right? Yes, we are not just doing innovation for the sake of innovation in the public sector. We should be developing national innovation system for the sake of economic growth. However, that critical connection between innovation and economic growth is not going to happen by itself. Yes, we have alluded to it from the beginning of the quarter to date, but today we want to speak more emphatically, more explicitly at the need for that connection to be made and the role of leadership in making that critical connection between national innovation systems and economic growth. Now we're beginning to get to the bottom of the barrel, right? So today's episode is looking at the role of leadership in synchronizing national innovation systems and economic growth. I repeat, today's episode is is focusing on the role of leadership in synchronizing national innovation systems and economic growth. It's not something to be implied at all. We cannot just leave it in the realm of the explicit. It is so critical that we need to speak more directly to it. We need to address it much more explicitly, that leadership is responsible for synchronizing national innovation systems and economic growth. If innovation is not going to be for the sake of innovation, if we're going to see it through from conceptualization all the way to commercialization, if we're going to develop national innovation systems that support deliberate, targeted economic growth, then leadership must be in place. Leadership must have leadership must not only have the oversight function, but leadership must play that oversight role as effectively as possible, because the reality is that the responsibility belongs to leadership, right? The responsibility of making that critical connection between innovation systems, between national innovation systems and economic growth is that of leadership. However, it is very, very important that we make it explicit that there must be a visionary leadership. We've been implying it not just from the beginning of this quarter, but from the beginning of last quarter, and even more in this quarter, where we've looked at the economic growth end of innovation, right? Where we've been saying there's a purpose to innovation. Innovation is a process, right? Innovation must not be an output that ends there. It should be leading to a forward-thinking, a strategic chief technology officer should be thinking of how our technology should drive market penetration, should lead to increase in market share, and so on. Definitely, I will be the first person to say that whoever occupies that role, if he or she is effective enough, he or she should understand that technology is not for the sake of technology. Technology is for the purpose of market penetration, business growth, sustainable business growth. Definitely. However, he or she will be responsible for it, but he or she is not accountable for it. So yes, a forward-thinking chief technology officer in a private sector organization should definitely be thinking of how to use technology to stimulate business growth. He or she should go beyond technology for the sake of technology, but he or she at best is only responsible for that. The one with the overall accountability for synchronizing technology and business growth, market share penetration, market share increase, market penetration, and so on and so forth, is the CEO of the organization, the board of the organization. Those are the ones with the responsibility for asking questions that would ensure an effective synchronization between technology and business growth. Similarly, in the public sector, in nations, right? Yes, we need to have forward-thinking national innovation managers who are able to think about the fact that they are to partner with those in charge of economic growth, those more directly responsible for driving economic growth. They are to partner with them to ensure that they are identifying how and where innovation can be used to stimulate economic growth. However, ultimately, neither the national innovation managers, the direct national innovation managers, nor the direct economic growth handlers, so to say, those who are directly responsible for setting economic goals, those who are directly responsible for monitoring economic growth, for evaluating economic growth, identifying the factors that enable or disable economic or challenge economic growth. Much as they also should be, partnering with all the critical stakeholders to ensure that all the enablers they need for economic growth are present, yet it is not the overall accountability of those responsible for economy. For instance, the Minister of Economic Growth in some nations, as it may be called, or the Secretary of Economy in some other nations, whatever you want to call them, the central bank government, or the central bank governor, as the case may be, all those who have direct responsibility Take note of the word responsibility, not accountability. All those who have direct responsibility for managing the economy of a nation, ultimately would, should and collaborate with those in charge of the national innovation system, to ensure that there is that synchronization, or to at least request the synchronization, facilitate the synchronization. I don't want to use the word jumpstart, but where necessary, kickstart what needs to be kickstarted, make case for change, and so on and so forth. But ultimately, and this is the point of today's episode, ultimately, the role with the accountability, with oversight, right, for ensuring that synchronization, that effective synchronization between national innovation systems and economic goals is that of the commander-in-chief, like some nations will say, or the president, like some nations will say, and so on and so forth. Ultimately, it is that of leadership. And this takes me back to last week's program, like last week's episode, like we usually do. I'm going to capture some of the highlights of last week's episode. And the reason is that you need to see why those things we've been talking about already imply what we're making more explicit today, right? It already implied. Last week we emphasized the need for vision, right? The reason why that synchronization can happen, or it happen effectively, is because to start with, there is a vision. Last week we looked at innovation adaptation for commercialization. We started looking at it two episodes ago, and we finalized it last episode, at least for the purpose of this quarter. It can be an endless conversation, but we brought it to a close for the sake of time at the end of last episode. We said there needs to be, and this is quoting from last week, there needs to be there must be targeted innovation activities, and those innovation activities must be targeted at driving economic growth. I'm quoting verbatim from last week. There must be targeted innovative activities, and those innovative activities must be targeted at driving economic growth, the kind that will eliminate the creative gap. That creative gap which can only be bridged when innovative activities are targeted. Now, the question is, who is doing the targeting? Right? So there needs to be targeted innovative activities. Beautiful. Those innovative activities must be targeted at driving innovative growth. Beautiful, right? Creative activities must be targeted at driving innovative economic growth. But who is doing the targeting? And this is where leadership comes in. There needs to be a visionary lead for effective synchronization between economic goals and innovation systems. I repeat, there needs to be a visionary lead for effective synchronization between economic goals and innovation systems and activities. That visionary lead is the one that would see what neither those in charge of the economy directly, nor those in charge of innovation systems solely might be seen. And that's the purpose of oversight, right? The reason why you have oversight is because that role sees all. It sees over all. That role sees the point of connection more effectively, because that role actually understands what's happening in economic management. That role has a grasp of what's happening with innovation management. That role sees all the potentials as well as the pitfalls, and that role is likely, or should, if that role is well executed, that role should be in a better position to make those strategic synchronization. I hope I'm making sense. Again, we are drawing from last week, and we're using last week to emphasize where we're going this week to make the case for this week. Remember, this week's episode, at least we're beginning the conversation. We may not wrap it up today. We may finish next week. But this week's conversation is clearly about the role of leadership in synchronizing national innovation systems and economic goals. I repeat, the role of leadership in synchronizing national innovation systems and economic growth, right? Yes, there are two parts to the equation. There is the innovation part of the equation, and there is the economic growth part of the equation. And what we're saying is that there needs to be an effective synchronization between the first part of the equation and the second part of the equation. The question now is, who is it to synchronize? Whose responsibility is it to synchronize? Who has that accountability, the overall accountability of ensuring not just the synchronization, but an effective synchronization between national innovation systems and economic goals. And that is the role of leadership oversight, because that effective vision to begin with should come from leadership. The reason why that role exists, the leadership role exists, is first and foremost to see. I like to say that if vision is not one of the primary responsibilities of the head, God will not put eyes in the head. Right? So one of the reasons why one of the most prominent parts of our head is the eyes is because God expects headship to see. In fact, before you even see, you think. And I think that my hypothesis is that there's a very strong correlation between how we think and what we see. Because I strongly opine that it's even when you think and how you think that you begin to see, right? So let's not go into the depth of that today. One thing I want you to see is this. Headship or leadership has a responsibility for cognitive leadership, right? Cognitive direction. The leader has the responsibility to, look at data, to synchronize data, to identify patterns, to look at trends, to do benchmarking, to do peer analysis, to take longitudinal studies over a given period, and all of that thinking should eventually produce a certain scene. Right, from the thinking, from the reflections, from the analysis, from all of that should flow a certain vision that aims to drive a greater correlation between national innovation activities and economic goals. My name is Tuto Remara. This is Amogere Communications. Remember, we are looking at driving economic growth with innovation. That has been our quarter-long theme. And today we are looking more specifically at the role of leadership in synchronizing national innovation systems and economic growth. Again, one thing we said last week is that there must be targeted innovative activities, no doubt, right? And when we have these targeted innovative activities, these innovative activities must be targeted in a manner that is more strategically, intentionally, consistently, resiliently, and deliberately focused on economic growth. So, yes, we are targeting. We've looked at who is targeting. We also know what we are targeting and at what we are targeting. What we are targeting is innovative activities. What we are targeting at is economic growth. And we've answered the question of who should be doing the targeting. Ultimately, the role with accountability for doing this targeting is that of the overall leadership. Hence, the word oversight, because those who occupy that role will have the oversight. They will see the points of connectivity, the points of greater synergy between, for instance, national innovation and economic growth, because they see over all the activities. That those in that responsibility see not just the economic side of it, but they also see the innovation side of it. So they are in the better position to ensure that effective synchronization. And that's the question of how are we targeting? We must be targeting more strategically. Take note of that word. What does it mean to target it more strategically? When you are strategic, you get the best. You get your bang for the buck, so to say, right? You optimize resources, and that's why I said, much as those in charge of national innovation or those in charge of economic growth, they do their best. Those who have oversight, who have the total picture, if I can use that word, overall leadership should be doing the targeting. We are now answering the question of how we should be doing the targeting. We should be doing the targeting in a manner that is more strategic. And that is why the overall leadership should take accountability, should be accountable for that targeting, because the overall leadership has the better overview and should be able to direct the targeting of innovative activities and economic growth in a manner that is most strategic, in a manner that will deliver optimum returns. Again, last week we said sometimes while nations are setting aside funds for creative activity, they do not simultaneously create funds for the commercialization of those inventive activities. Again, we are still back to the issue of synchronization, right? Because those when you understand the role of, if I may use that expression, when you understand the role of divisions or departments, right, you realize that honestly, it is not essentially, like I said, they may have responsibility for this, but it's not essentially the accountability of divisional or departmental heads to facilitate those synergies. Now, does that mean that they should not lead their own divisions or departments or ministries or agencies with a consciousness of that need for greater synergy? No, they should. They should, and that's why they're leaders, right? Even though they are not the overall leaders, they are still leaders. So they should definitely lead either the economic department or the innovation agencies with that consciousness of the need for synergy. However, if we are going to have, like we were saying last week, if we're going to have that commercialization, conceptualization to commercialization flow, right? We've been saying this since January. If you're going to have the whole spectrum of innovation covered, right, effectively from conceptualization to commercialization, then the role of the leader that has the that has the oversight, right, that has accountability for all the touch points, take note of that word, all the touch points, all the critical touch points between conceptualization and commercialization should be held accountable for how well we commercialize. This is a whole conversation, and I want you to take this very, very importantly. So I want to break this down a bit so that I'm sure that we understand what I'm saying. I'm not in a hurry, like I said. We will likely finish this in the next episode, or at least wrap it up in the next episode for the sake of time, by the grace of God. But let me just make this analogy to break this down a bit. So here is the commander-in-chief, or the president, whatever the title is. Here is the commander-in-chief at the helm of affairs, and that commander-in-chief has a vision, or should have a vision, to ensure that the innovative activities in a nation are leading to increased economic growth in terms of GDP, in terms of GDP per capita, in terms of controlled inflation, in terms of employment, all the factors by which we want to measure, right? The commander-in-chief should have that overall accountability. Now, because the commander-in-chief also have oversight of all the interconnecting points. Let me explain what I mean by interconnecting points. Let's take education, for instance. There is an interconnecting point, for instance, between education and innovation, right? The quality of human resources being churned out, the quality of education policies, the quality of STEM activities, STEM there standing for science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, the quality of entrepreneurial engagement, entrepreneurial support. All of these things will ultimately impact the kind of creative technologies that a nation is churning out and how the nation is churning out these creative activities, right? So one of the points of interconnection, and if you want to learn more about this, please subscribe to Amoge Radio Communications, our YouTube page, especially check out last quarter's episode, Developing National Innovation Systems Adaptive Capacity. We spoke a lot about the connection between the town and gown, between industry and academia. Even within industry, we talked about those who are more given to research versus those who are more given to commercialization. There are so many points of connection. Now, the departmental heads do not have the mandate to ensure an effective synchronization of all the touch points. We do not. If your country is a democratic country, we do not elect the departmental heads, for instance. We do not elect the ministers, like they said, like you said in some nations. We elect the commander-in-chief, and it's the commander-in-chief that has the mandate to ensure an effective synchronization of all the touch points along that path from conceptualization to commercialization. Am I making sense? So that role, that accountability belongs to the overall leadership, right? And his or her team, definitely. But that role, right, it now has to, ensure that the facilitation of increased synergy between the departmental heads is done seamlessly, such that the touch points are integrating much more efficiently, much more responsibly, and much more promptly to respond to the changing dynamics of an ever-evolving 21st century. The world is on a constant move. So that role, the overall leadership is the one that has the accountability for guaranteeing, not just ensuring, but guaranteeing a seamless sync between each touch point as necessary. Very, very, very important. That way, we are going to have a much more efficient targeting of innovative activities and economic outcomes. Very, very important. In the absence of that, there's going to be a lot of waste. And that's what we talked about last week and 2 weeks ago, that in many nations, it's been said that even though a lot of creative activities are happening, even though a lot of innovative activities are happening, there is no clear path to commercialization. And this is one of the things we said last week. Last week we said the research indicates that there is insufficient research on research commercialization. Permit my deliberate repetition. I'm using it here to drive home a point that we do not have enough research on research commercialization. That is because the overall function, right, the leadership of the process of conceptualization to commercialization is, to be honest, not doing enough here to facilitate that synchronization between innovation and economic activities. It is not the role of those in charge of innovation, the national innovation managers, to ultimately ensure, to guarantee this synchronization. Neither is it the overall responsibility of those responsible for economic growth. Yes, there's an extent to which they are answerable for it, but ultimately it is the overall leadership's responsibility to create that pathway from conceptualization to commercialization. Well, before we round off for today, I want to quickly give us an idea of a nation that has done a little bit of work, some work in this regard, just to give a sense, to sort of illustrate the point we are making here, right? So there's a nation called Indonesia, right? Indonesia is a nation in the continent of Asia, and Indonesia tried to do something, and this was studied in a report called Connecting All the Dots. I like the word because it's like another word for synchronization, connected. So they said connecting all the dots, and for them, those who put this paper together try to identify the challenges in establishing effective innovation system in Indonesia. But the title of the paper begins with connecting all the dots, in case you want to check it out. What I like about this is that, in putting together this paper, and in the course of doing this research, they identified two things that are very critical. One, they said, look, one of the 8 Indonesian development missions that was clearly stated in a law. Can you imagine? In a law, right? The law, in other words, policy was made into legislation. That's another very important thing. If you want to see sustainability, do not just put together policies that can be undone by the next administration. Do your best to translate policy into legislation, like we have with Obamacare and other such legislations in other nations. So this policy was translated into a law, and the law was titled Long-Term National Development Plan. Take note, these things oftentimes cannot be rushed, especially if you want to lay them as solid institutional pillars for continuity and sustainability. So it was called the Long-Term National Development Plan, and it was to run from 2005 from 2025. Another reason I found this interesting is because it's been 20 years already, and it'll be interesting to watch and see how much of this has been covered, how much of it growth has happened as a result of this. But that's not what we're going to do. What we're going to do is to look at what they did with this 20-year plan, this long-term national development plan. So they broke this long-term plan into 4 medium-term national development plans. And I also like that, right? Because again, the devil is in the details, like they say. And number 2, if you're going to be big on execution, then you must learn to face things. PHASE is something we do a lot in Amalgate, and something we believe very strongly in. So they took this 20-year national development plan, this long-term national development plan, and they phased it into a 4-year, into a 4-phase plan, a plan of 4 phases. So the first one was from 2005 to 2009, and this was looking at generally where were they, how could they move from where they were to where they should be. So because we were still sort of laying the foundation, this first plan did not specify the role of science and technology in reforming Indonesian development. They didn't do that necessarily, which is fine. But by the second one, right, so 2005 to 2009 did not look specifically at the role of science and technology in reforming Indonesian development. In other words, it did not look very critically at the role of innovation in driving economic development. However, by the second phase, right, deliberately, after laying a general foundation in the first phase, by the second phase, the second medium-term development plan, which was 2010 to 2014, they ensured that they looked at the need for increasing the quality of human resources, including the efforts to build capacity in science and technology in order to strengthen economic competitiveness. Can you understand what they're doing here? They are making those connecting points. Can you see why the title of the paper is connecting the dots? So in the first 5 years, in the first phase of this 20-year plan, the first 25% was generally done private gathering data, analyzing factors, looking at the trends, identifying the patterns, which is perfectly fine. We will do that as consultants. We will do that in Amagate. But by the second phase, they were now already looking at the need for increasing the quality of human resources, connecting points, in order to ensure that they build capacity in science and technology. Can you see that connecting point? There's a connecting point between human resources and science and technology, but it doesn't stop there. It goes further to ensure that this capacity in science and technology, which is built through the quality of human resources that is intentionally developed, is now translating into Indonesia's economic competitiveness. Do you understand? Very, very deliberate, right? So the second phase of Indonesia's 20-year long-term development plan now focuses on increasing the quality of human resources, using efforts to build capacity. Sometimes we think national innovation managers have the accountability for ensuring that synchronization between innovation and economy, or we think that those with responsibility for managing the economy, the national economy. China did this almost 50 years ago. What is your nation doing? These things cannot be implied. They must be explicitly and categorically articulated, with the leadership of the nation accepting the overall responsibility for facilitating an effective and efficient synergy between technology and economic growth, between innovation and economic development. Well, in 1995, of course, China launched its national development strategy, and again, they were focusing on invigorating China through science and technology and education. Again, talk about the touch points: education, then innovation, then economic growth. And I can go on and on, but this is where we're going to stop today. This is where we are going to call it a day. I'm sure you get the point. We are saying today that even though we've been implying it, it is time to make it explicit that the role of leadership in synchronizing national innovation systems and economic growth is that of the overall leader of a nation. They assume overall accountability. They have oversight. They have full accountability for facilitating an effective synergy between national innovation systems and economic growth, economic progress, economic development. The buck stops with them. Yes, they must hire, they must recruit departmental heads of innovation and economic who can work together to facilitate, to stimulate, to accelerate that synergy, and so on and so forth. But ultimately, the buck rests with the overall leadership of the nation. That is how critical it is to ensure an effective synergy between innovation and economic development. Well, I hope we've made some sense to you today, and I hope that you're listening either as a policymaker or as a policy influencer or a policy demander. This is the way to go in these days of artificial intelligence, of generative AI, in these days where DeepSeek is taking more and more command, in these days where NVIDIA chips are losing ground to more efficient chip makers. There's so much we couldn't go into today. You can read the news. You are seeing that technology is a critical factor in what happens in your economy. In these days where a doctor who is called the doctor of doom because he tended to predict more of doom, in these days when he's saying, well, regardless of the doom that we've been seeing because of artificial intelligence, even though the tariff war has had its negative impact on the economy, I'm bold to say we would still likely see more of boom BOOM than gloom because of technology, because of artificial intelligence. In these days where technology is that critical to economic stability, not to talk of growth, you cannot leave the synchronization of technology and innovation, technology and economic growth, innovation and economic growth. You cannot leave it to only the departmental managers, but the overall leadership of the nation has to take full accountability for it. It's been wonderful doing this with you. My name is Toro Modara. This has been Amoge Radio Communications program, which is driving economic growth with innovation. And I've thoroughly enjoyed looking at the concept, looking at the challenge, looking at the burden of responsibility where it lies, and it has been the role of leadership in synchronizing national innovation systems and economic growth. I'll be back same time, same station next week. Until then, please reach us on Amogates through our social media platforms, Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram. Please subscribe to Amoge Radio Communications, share with your friends. It's such a rich reservoir of knowledge. Look at what we've been discussing, and more importantly, let's work with you on building these systems. Let's work with you on facilitating this synergy. Let's work with you on stimulating this sync between your economic progress and your innovation systems. Thank you so much, and remember to join us on the rest of our programs from tomorrow all the way to Friday and even to Monday as we continue to bring you depth, breadth, and of course insights that are very unique to our multi-sectoral practice areas. Thank you so much again, and see you same time, same station next week. Have a good one.